sort of start this interview by inviting you to introduce yourself and wondering if you'd be able to tell us a little bit about your story and how it's led you to your current role.
Actually, I have been working for over 10 years. Initially, I was working in marketing. Then I sort of like gave up everything and went to London for chasing my fashion dream. And since then, I've been working for fashion for over 7 years already. Yeah. And now I'm currently working a multi-brand store quite famous in China, and they have 2 offline stores and Tmall store as well as B2B showroom. Also, they have their own brand as well. I'm in charge of the B2B showroom and Tmall store, both. Yes.
So maybe you know this. I'm new to Parsons into New York. I joined in the summer, and I came from a university in Canada in Toronto called Ryerson University. And so I guess I'll tell you a little bit about my journey there before coming here. So I first started in fashion when I was a teenager, when I was 14, really by fluke. My friend had taken a course to learn how to be a model, learned about how to prepare for a casting, walk on a runway, got photos, but was told she wasn't the right size to be a model. And she's probably a dress size like 16 or 18. And at that point, all the agencies said she needed to be a size like 4 or 2 to be successful. And to me, this didn't make any sense, but I didn't know anything about the industry, but I thought she should be able to be a successful model. And so I ended up taking her photos and just like randomly sending them off to some local magazines. And I ended up getting a response from one of them who wanted to hire her and assumed that I was her agent, to which I just said yes and kind of faked my way through it. But with that, she got a modeling job. I somehow figured out how to do it. And then from there, really started to represent her, started to represent other friends, and then started a modeling agency really in my parents' house. While I was in school, there was an agency that was dedicated to representing models that weren't at that point really being represented by other agencies. So fashion models of really diverse sizes, ages, races, disabilities, really an inclusive modeling agency, which like today is becoming much more common. But at that point, in the late 90s, this was not the case. So that's really what I started and started learning about the business. And while that happened, I stayed in school. I ended up doing an undergraduate degree in women and gender studies at the University of Toronto. And primarily that's because I wanted to understand more about visual cues and imagery, understanding more about how gender was, how the model, how there's so much conversation about models being dehumanized and objectified. And so I wanted to understand more about how personhood could be celebrated, how models could have more agency in the process, more about workers' rights. So that's sort of where I started to study that. And I continued to run my business, and it grew. And we represented about 150 models. We had about 10 full-time agents and staff working at the agency in Toronto. And then I decided to continue with my education, kind of move on to doing a master's and then a PhD in business at Cambridge. And I guess my reason for doing those degrees really came from my industry experience. A lot of designers and fashion editors thought, diversity was really nice. They understood the social value, but they weren't sure of the business value. In a luxury fashion ad, would a model that didn't represent this Western beauty ideal really stimulate purchase intentions? The idea is that advertising needed to be aspirational. And so my research, both of my master's and my PhD, was really trying to investigate what consumers wanted to see in fashion ads, how models of different sizes, ages, races, or disabilities would influence consumer behavior. And so that's really what I did, and then really continued to run my business at the same time. And sort of at the end of the research, one of the main findings was that consumers, it wasn't the size or the race or the age of the models that influenced behavior. Consumers wanted to see diversity, but it was really about the creative direction and the artistry of the ad. And often ads with diverse models, particularly plus size models or disabled models or older models, lacked that aspiration, like the creativity and the glamour and the dream of fashion, everything that makes it. It wasn't about the body, but it was about that kind of creative direction and the design. And so recognizing that to change that, models were just one small part. Really part of the change was to change the worldviews and paradigms and practices of folks making those ads. So from design to photography to creative direction, etc., and influencing the business decisions. And so that led me to kind of decide that I wanted to teach, and I applied for a job as an assistant professor at Ryerson in their School of Fashion, and I started teaching there, and then kind of moved along that, moved my research in that direction, eventually became chair of the fashion school, and that kind of brought me here to Parsons. But a lot of the work driving sort of my, I guess, both teaching practice but also academic vision was how can fashion schools really ground equity, inclusion, and social justice as like a guiding principle of what they do, because that's how you shift and shape the kind of worldviews of the next generation that is going to be creating the fashion and business strategies that we see.
You have been leading conversations and leading big efforts, and you have lived up to so many roles. So my question here is, how would you define yourself today? Let's say your leadership style, your vision, and the impact your mentors around you had in shaping who you are today. Thank you.
I think my leadership style and my vision and like that is, I think that's always changing. I don't think it's like, right, it's as I'm learning more, it's always shifting. I think, first and foremost, I think like that very beginning experience I had in women and gender studies, like forever shaped my perspective on leadership, and it continues to. So really learning about Black feminist thought and intersectionality was critical for me thinking about who I am in the world and the position I take up as a leader. Obviously being like a white man, that's not something I ever had to think about until I started taking gender studies courses and then understanding about systems of privilege and oppression. And a lot of my work has realized that because of the body I'm in, I've been able to say particular things and do particular things that might from other people be dismissed and that might be seen as activist versus business, simply because of the body I inhabit. And so I think part of what's always guided me is how can I use the body I'm in to enter spaces to advance strategies and conversations that then open up those spaces for others who've been alienated from those spaces and then step back and let them lead. So part of it is how can I get into spaces, change the conversation, open those up, and then recognize when it's my role to step back and let other people really lead. And that's been, I think, a fundamental strategy. Just recognizing the things I've talked about, other people have talked about too. I'm not the first one to talk about inclusion and social justice in fashion when I was 14 or today, but I think that it's seen differently because of the body I'm in, because I have the PhD in management, because of all of these things. And so that's been, I think, really important. I think the other thing in terms of leadership that's been important for me has really been thinking about creating visions and strategies that are truly collaborative and grounded in the stakeholders of the community. I think a mistake often leaders make is thinking that the vision is their vision, or that as like the leader, you need to create a vision by yourself, which not only disregards or sidesteps the knowledge that community holds, but it also puts like a ridiculous amount of pressure on you to think you have to do everything by yourself, which is super stressful. And so part of, I think, my approach has been, how do I see myself as a leader, whether it was a chair or a dean, is how do I facilitate conversation from community? How do I make sure that there's spaces where everyone's voices can be heard? part of my job is to sift through all of those voices and knowledge and bring them together in plans and vision, but recognizing those don't have to come from me, that I can really facilitate that inclusively of community through collaboration. And so that, I think, has been fundamental to my approach. And then I think the last thing I'll say that's also, I think, every day really important, and that I think often we miss in leadership, is the role of humility. I think often leaders are worried that once they're critiqued, they feel they've done something wrong and they have to defend what they've done, rather than truly recognizing like critique or feedback as like opportunities to shift your perspective, to grow, to learn, and seeing critique and feedback as acts of generosity rather than something you need to defend, right? Someone cares enough about the organization, about the community, about you to tell you. And it's obviously something, you know, often mostly done unintentionally, you never meant to do. And so I think really reframing critique that all leaders face, rather than being defensive, but seeing it as an act of generosity and embracing it and listening to that and sitting with that. So yeah, I think those are probably three things that really shaped my own approach to leadership.
I would like to say I'm sort of like a data-driven person, and also I think I would like to say I'm sort of like a data-driven person, and also focus on the goal I'm going to achieve. So basically, like right now, I'm leading a 8-person team. So I set up the goal, and also we have a KPI every month, and I divide it into 4 different people. And I would like to discover like everyone's capability and advantages, and see how we can reach the goal. That's my main purpose, I think. Yeah, I think because I have both like a marketing and retail experience, I think they are quite different. What I learned from these two parts. So like when I was working in marketing sites, we more like a creative mind. But in retail sites, we more focus on the data. So that's the very obvious difference from my point of view. So I think that's the reason I prefer like focus on the data more than I mean the KPI we are going to achieve. So that's why I'm more like data driven person. When we talk about retail sales, we all think about the sales, like a GMV and the sales report. And we have to focus on the data. I mean, that's different from the marketing part, because, you know, when you work in marketing sites, you all focus on like how I can arise our target audience interest. That's a different thing. So when I'm right now working in retail side, so I feel like the sales report can tell everything. I mean, if we are successful or not, we can see from the sales report. That's the reason we have to become like a data-driven person.
I've shared so many ideas and experience on leadership. Could you describe your influence on the culture within some of the organization you have led?
Every organization I've been in, I mean, I think when you're an entrepreneur and you get to create your own business and you get to hire everyone, right, in a sense, you really can help foster the culture, especially as a like small business or small or medium-sized business, because you really can craft what are those values and ethos of a culture. What does that look like? How do you want to like implement that and execute it? It becomes different, obviously, when you are hired into larger organizations and they each have very distinct cultures. So I think the culture of the organization I was at before, my university in Canada was a publicly funded university. The culture, I'm going to say, was very driven in like systems and processes, a bit more hierarchical. There was space for people to contribute, but there were also like particular ways of doing things. I find since coming to Parsons, it's much more nimble and responsive. There's much more ways to like change things as the world is changing quickly. It's a community that really values like shared governance and shared leadership. And so there's much more spaces for people to have a role and a say. I think the other unique thing about Parsons in this organization, just like in your classes, right, there are faculty and students from around the world. And so part of that requires a shift in vision, in strategy, in work to decenter in some ways a US-centered perspective. And that obviously for a US-based organization is a challenge. But that's certainly something that I think as leaders, when you're in an organization that's based in one country, but that has constituents that are global, to really be mindful of the different perspectives and experiences that exist based on where folks come from, and to make sure that you're developing strategy and policy and planning that is expansive versus centering one perspective. And I think part of, particularly in international or global organizations, it's not about like not having an American vision or culture or perspectives, but about not making that the dominant or only way of thinking. So how does that open up to really allow more of a plurality of different perspectives? So I think that's been really critical in thinking through the culture of the organization, particularly when you have like faculty, student, staff that do come from around the world and bring that really diverse viewpoint and perspective and lived experience with them.
I remember when I was working in London, I worked in different brand companies. To be honest, I didn't tell too much difference between like international companies and the local companies. But the culture, I have to say, yeah, there are indeed some different things. I feel like more easygoing in international companies, and especially on Fridays, especially in Europe. So everyone just feel like they more relaxing, enjoy lives, but not in. But when I work in China, I just feel like everyone has to work really, really hard, even during the weekend. That's what I feel different. Yeah. And I think the culture is like European, more like enjoy life and relax. And I feel like working is just for living a better life. But in China, I feel like it's different. I feel like everyone has to work really hard. And I feel like Chinese people might more care about like a material lives. Yeah.
Ask you, because you are like a force of change within the fashion industry and like coming in with like such fresh perspectives. I'm kind of curious to know that in the beginning of your career, what were some of the challenges you faced?
I think there are a few. I think at the beginning, obviously when you have new ideas, there's often resistance. I think for me at the beginning, trying to bring issues that had existed before in activist or social justice communities into business were immediately written off, because it was seen that these two forces, that business and activism, were in deep opposition. And the only ways corporations or the fashion industry can engage in social responsibility was like through like this corporate social responsibility model, where you run your business any way you want, and then you donate a portion of your sales to charity, or you have a foundation, or you do this, rather than that being deeply embedded in your business, and recognizing that knowledge and expertise of how you make your business social deeply from its core doesn't need to be invented in the corporation, but that actually exists already in social movements, that exist in activist communities. And part of the work of particularly for-profit corporations is to really reach out to communities and think about how do we translate that knowledge, how do we create positions, how do we collaborate in ways that really transform an organization. So I think a lot of it was trying to advance social justice in industry was seen as one impossible because these forces were just like the dominant perspectives that, you know, activism and social justice and business and profit were in opposition and they couldn't meet, without realizing that that like binary is artificial. And in fact, businesses could and can make the world better by deeply embedding the values of social justice into what they do, and that knowledge to do that effectively requires outreach, collaboration, deep engagement with social movements. That's how we transform hiring practices and promotion. That's how we transform how we design our products and manufacture our products. That's how we completely redesign the organization and an industry. And so part of it was trying to straddle these two worlds of like working in the for-profit, the fashion industry, and then also trying to bring in activist and social justice knowledge around body diversity, around equity, around, you know, all of these things. I think a lot of what I've seen, like then moving in academia was very similar too. You either did like a women's studies degree that was purely like kind of social justice and, you know, intersectional feminist thought, or you did a business degree, but like these two knowledge spaces didn't connect. And I think like as an educator and researcher, I found the greatest kind of innovation in some ways by bringing like the women's studies and the queer studies and the disability studies together with fashion studies and management and IT and like that literature, and seeing what happens when these are in dialogue. And I think that guided my practice as like an entrepreneur, that guided my practice as like an educator and then like academic leader. And that's certainly how I think now. So even today as an academic leader, like so much of my thinking is like, how do I bring these different spaces together and try to put them in conversation rather than having these kind of artificial silos? So I think that was the biggest challenge, is this idea that social justice could never really be advanced through business because business is inherently bad. And, you know, there'll always be folks who think that, right, like business will never actually advance social change. You have to transform capitalism. It's inherently evil. I hear that perspective. I also think that we're in this current system, so how do we transform it from within? And that the fashion industry, you know, can do a lot of good and still be a successful business. So how do we advance that in a way that really is transformational? And that becomes then just part of the ethos of what the organization is.
I think at the very beginning, I still remember it was like 10 years ago when I think my first job, I was working the biggest advertising company in the world. It's called Manshare Group, WPP Group, yes. It's a British advertising company, biggest advertising company in the world. It's a big company, so the competition, you can feel the competition. It's not because it's not just from your team members, also from other teams, because everyone wanna like to get a sort of like a really good role or title in the company. So sometimes you can feel the office politics, yeah, office politics, yeah, in the office. So which I really don't like it.
In a leadership role, what would you consider
Yeah.
your greatest weakness or vulnerability, and how did you learn about it?
I think to be a leadership, I have to be very like a constancy and have very clear logistic mind, because you need to make the strategy not just for the goal you are going to reach, and also for your team members. So I have to say the weakness of a leader shouldn't be too hesitating. Hesitating. Yes, hesitating, because this gonna stop you to make a right decision and postpone the progress you're working on. And you are as a team leader, you're gonna lead your team to the final goal, and they sort of it's sort of like a small army you're lead to. So you need to let them know the very clear strategy and step by step, and how we can reach the goal. And also the team member will have confidence to be work with you. Otherwise they feel like, oh, we even have no idea what we're gonna do for the next stop, how we can reach the goal, and which gonna ruin the whole team. Yeah.
One more question. How do you communicate your goals to your team, and how do you get them sort of motivated to work?
Yeah. Every time the final goal looks really big all the time. So, but you shouldn't, at the very beginning, you shouldn't make your team members feel like it's really hard to reach. You have to divide the goal different steps. Like, for example, if the goal is for the whole year, you can divide it into like different seasons, and then for different months. And they would know, like, for this month we are going to finish what goal we are going to reach to, and to motivate them to fight for this, not just like look at the goal and feel like, oh, it's really difficult to reach it. Also, I think it's also about like the strategy you're going to make for your membership. Sometimes they have no idea, because I feel like the leadership is need to solve the problems, not just like doing something. And you need to let your team members to understand the goal and how we can reach it, and make sure they have really clear mind as you have. Yes, that's what I saw.
Obviously, one of the things as a leader is sometimes, right, you could ask for as much feedback and conversation around decision making, but sometimes that decision making is yours. And recognizing that not everyone will always agree with that decision. And some people might be very upset or angry with the decision, because you can never please everyone. I think that's certainly been one of the hardest things, is recognizing that I can never fully engage. I will never make every single person in my in the organization or where I work with happy. I think how I've learned to deal with it is one, consent. We may not always reach consensus, right? People have different opinions, and you have to respect that. I think that making decisions doesn't always mean listening to the majority. I think sometimes the best experiences come from folks who are not maybe in the majority of the organization. And I think I've been very inspired by knowing that often, in disability justice, one of the principles is that we have to listen first to folks who have been the most excluded or the most marginalized, because often they have the deepest knowledge of what needs to change, and they've been most excluded from decision making and process and systems until then. And often my decision making has been listening to everyone, but really valuing some of the folks who have been maybe the most alienated in the organization, who have the least power in the organization, who bring such valuable knowledge, but that knowledge hasn't been centered. And recognizing that in listening to that knowledge, even if it's not in the majority, that's really how we get a transformation. So I think that that's often, and that often goes against, well, you just listen to what most people say when you're making a decision. And often that doesn't really lead to change. That just leads to reinforcing the status quo, because the majority of people are often the ones with the most power, already in the dominant group, etc. I think I've also learned to deal with this challenge of making difficult decisions is recognizing everyone won't agree, but if you can be completely transparent in the decision, right? Like knowing you have consulted the community, your constituents, your staff, your colleagues, like everyone's been consulted, and then you've made a decision and you can explain to people why you've made that decision. You can properly articulate the rationale rather than just making a decision and not telling people or explaining why, or just say, I've listened, this is the decision. Often folks will feel like, well, did they even listen to me? Why was this decision made? Recognizing you can't always tell all information, right? There's always stuff in confidence, but as much as possible to foster that transparency and accountability by detailing the reasons for that decision. You went through your process of consultation. This is what you've heard. This is the decision you made and why. And articulating that clearly for everyone as much as possible, I think is also helpful, because people might disagree, but at least they can understand why you arrived at that conclusion, and that you respect them enough to tell them about the process you went through to make that decision.
Like, we all have leaders, and what techniques have you used to gain support from your leaders, or it can be your followers or like colleagues, in implementing your own vision within organizations? Would you be able to share some practical tips to us? Thank you.
I think that's a great question. I mean, I think that building consensus and building alliances and support is critical for any leader when making decisions, particularly when you're leading to make change. I think what's important is that creating broad enough visions and strategies that allow everyone to see, or as many people as possible, to see themselves in it. I think often we can be so, like, sometimes strategies and visions can be narrow enough that folks don't feel they're part of it. And so I think it's defining it in a way that's broad, but also ensuring that your colleagues, your staff are part of the creation of that vision, so that they've helped articulate it and they feel invested in co-authoring it, because then there's a buy-in. And so that co-authorship is really, really important. And I think that also, like, that's obviously leading with folks who you might manage or who are on your team, but I think that's also very similar when you're also dealing with folks, in a sense, in a hierarchical organization that are above you. They may not be directly involved in crafting every detail, but to keep them engaged in every process, to keep them engaged as you develop, to create space for their perspective so they also feel that they're co-authors, in a sense, and that you're aligned with their goals and their vision. So I think the most is really, by really creating leadership that's collaborative, you allow people to feel they're all co-creators or co-generators of what's happening, and then they see themselves in it and they feel invested and they support that moving forward. And so often it's not just folks, create the vision, other folks will implement it. You want to try to get rid of that divide and, in a sense, have everyone involved in developing the strategy and in implementation, so everyone feels they've co-developed that strategy and then has more, I think, deep excitement and true enthusiasm when it comes to executing those plans.
Quite old-fashioned. The technique I use is just like a schedule, some schedules and to-do list. And so I like my team members to list everything they are going to do and summarize everything they accomplished a day. Yeah. Then I can I can understand what they are doing and what kind of problem they met, and if they need me to solve the problem. Because I need to know, some members, they don't want to say something, especially when they met some problems. They just feel like they can handle this. But as a team leader, you need to understand if they can solve the problem. Sometimes they need your help. They just don't know how to say it. So I've like to let them list everything during the day, and also at the weekend. I mean, on Friday normally, I may let them to have like a weekly report, and also we are going to have a weekly report and a monthly report for our clients as well. Yes.
Thank you for mentioning the way you communicate to your team members. So I have a follow-up question. What are the ways you use to communicate to your leaders?
At the beginning, I'm going to write the strategies for my leader. Like if we are going to reach the goal, the strategies I'm going to make, all the plans I made for reach the goal. So apart from the plans, I will make. Also, I'm doing a lot of like reports, like weekly reports, monthly reports to my leader as well, because they also need to know what's the process, or maybe how the plan's going right now.
Question is also about the cultural thing. So can you tell me what is your approach to ensure an environment for seamless global communication and cross-cultural interaction with organization you have lead?
It's tough because we don't know what we don't know, right? Like all of us have grown up in a particular culture, in a particular society with a particular like worldview. That we've learned particular things based on how we communicate with obviously our friends, our family, in our space, in our community. And so that can obviously, if we haven't been exposed to other communities and other spaces and other cultures, right, we may not see, we won't know how they communicate. And so I think that a lot of the approach I think I've been able to implement or support is the idea of continued education for an organization, particularly around cultural awareness and understanding. I think so often people feel that I think very often people can take something personally if they they might feel nervous to engage, or if someone said actually what you've said is offensive, or actually how you've communicated in this way seems offensive, they can take it so deeply personally. And I think that it's really important as a culture for an organization to realize we all only know what we know based on our lived experience. Part of an organization, particularly an organization that is focused on a more global community, is to have continued education for everyone, to expose them and teach them and educate them about the different cultural groups, communication styles, belief systems of the folks who are part of that organization, who are their contractors, who are their staff, who are their consumers, to really develop that broad-based understanding and continuously have that education with more knowledge. And make it really clear, like we've all grown up in a particular society. This is what we know based on where we're positioned. Part of our work, particularly if our work is global, is to expand beyond that and recognize the plurality of cultures and communication styles. And so having continued education that an organization needs for its staff, I think is really helpful. And then you have an organization, it develops organizational culture, because then you have all staff in that organization go on that journey together. And so there's sort of collective learning and collective understanding And that becomes then just part of the ethos of who the what the organization is.
I remember when I was, my leaders always treat us as the same. So that's the reason I can't feel the difference. Unless we have Chinese clients come over and they need me a lot more than any other times. So apart from that, I can't see the difference. But when I'm working in China, yes, the international companies I used to work, we do have some like international stuff, but still I can't feel the difference. But I have to say, foreigners in China, they have some more like advantages than local people. Yeah, you know what I mean. And I don't know why, but it was 10 years ago. But now I feel like it's more equally now. Yeah.
Would you say that the fashion industry today, like in a world like the post-COVID world where we had to like adapt so much, would you still say that it is resistant to change in some ways?
Yeah, there's deep resistance to changing. I think maybe less about the clothing and more about the business models. I think there's a deep reliance on these business models that are tried and tested and true. And so there's nervousness around changing those models. There's been such a focus on fashion education, right? I really think education is the hub of innovation, because in some ways the classroom, the research labs, the university doesn't have the same financial goals or constraints that a for-profit corporation has. And so in a classroom and in a university, we can play a lot more and develop ideas and then take those ideas to industry through partnerships, through jobs, right? But in industry, it's often more challenging in some ways because there are very real financial constraints and risks that make organizations more reluctant to change. I think within education, the space has been so focused on design education from a very like material textile making perspective. So how do we continue to innovate fashion design and textile design? But there's been such less focus on fashion business and management. How do we innovate business models and business strategies and business plans, right? This is like, I mean, the fact that this program that you're in is only in its third year, I think is really a testament to that it's only recently that education has really said, no, we need to innovate business education and fashion. We need students to develop new models and new strategies and new understandings. So I think part of the resistance to change in some ways is maybe less about the industry and more that the academic space and education space hasn't yet fully fostered fashion business education for decades and decades and decades that have allowed that kind of originality and creativity and push to happen. And I think this is one of the first spaces where that really happens. And the idea is that it's really your cohort and like this program and other programs like it are where those new business models and strategies can be discussed, explored, and played with. And then folks move on to industry and then can bring those ideas with them based on their thinking within the classroom. So I think part of it is there's definitely resistance to change, particularly around business. And that's because, from my perspective, there hasn't been as much of a focus on business education and fashion as there has been on fashion design and textile design.
I think China, yeah. I think, yeah, the working environment has to be changed in China. And like I said, like 10 years ago, I can feel the difference from like a local, but now I feel like more equally now. And because some like foreigners here, they just feel like they have advantages than local people. But I don't think that the difference that obvious. And we all have the same like education background, and the only thing different is they are foreigners. So I think the working environment has to be changed in China now, but it's getting better.
So my last question is, what if there's only room for one advice for the future leaders? What would that be coming from you?
I think the best advice is honestly that I could say it's bringing different knowledge sets and experiences together and in conversation. So often things are so like siloed, like knowledge in like in marketing we read this, and innovation technology we read this, and fashion design is this, and fashion theory it's this. So there's really like so many ways where we learn so much about one area, but we're not bringing in another area or imagining what happens if those collide and happen in dialogue. And I think that some of the best change and transformation in the fashion industry that is like socially, environmentally, and economically driven will only happen by bringing different knowledge sets and people together who aren't currently talking. And I think it's really moving beyond the divide that there is this separation between social movements and activism and business and capitalism. And that if you do one, you can't do the other. Or that the future, right? Or you do one and you do it anyway, and then you support the other. And I think the more we can like get rid of those siloing, and the more in our projects, our work, our thinking, our decision making, we're bringing in these different knowledge sets that exist and perspectives. I think that's really the best advice, because that's certainly what's been, I think, transformational for me, is like talking to people, working with people who are engaged in so many different spaces and bringing it together. And it, for many ways, requires going back to the idea of humility, a deep humility in fashion, to realize fashion, you know, is a great industry. It's a very successful industry, but it doesn't know everything. And so to continuously change fashion, how do we bring in these other spaces that have never been part of fashion, but to fashion, to help really create new knowledge and new ideas and new practices? I think that would be my main advice. It's really the collision of different knowledges and experiences around the table and putting those in dialogue.
Open to all kinds of cultures and arts. We have to like open our minds and talk to young generations. I always like to speak to young generations. Sometimes I feel like I can get some inspiration from them. I need to understand what they like and what they care most in fashion, because you know they have different views, and we need to understand the market, how the market going, especially as a leader. Another reason is to understand how your team members feeling. Yeah, sometimes I feel like I'm like their big sister to look after all. Some of them just start their like career in fashion, so you have to like teach them. Then you can be a really good leader to lead them to reach the goal. Yeah, that's what I think.